interview, we're having a look at what happens within oneself as the mind when one is watching movies or television or reading something or seeing something in newspapers or magazines, and one immediately start becoming overwhelmed with an energetic emotional feeling response and start crying. And this can happen in relation to seeing scenes in movies, through seeing disturbing images, through hearing sounds, through hearing instruments, through seeing dancing, through reading a story. I mean, various trigger points can manifest in one's world and reality that stimulate that reaction of overwhelmingness in bringing oneself to tears, and can even accumulate to such an extent where one really feel like crying deeply. So let us have a look at some of the most primary contexts that happen and what they indicate. Let's take, for example, in movies where one sees scenes, and let's take a scene in where the most common one in seeing two lovers unite after a very horrific history that they individually walked and that eventually brought them together, and there's the music and the background and the tears and the kissing and the embracing, and one is within that brought to tears. That would be within oneself. One has to investigate where such a life experience that one had just viewed within this movie or within the series is actually existent as a desire within self, and where one has activated that desire within self through watching the movie of it, and now in a sense fulfilling that desire within self through the movie that's playing out, where one, for example, have an actual equal in one desire of walking or experiencing a life of difficulty and hardship and pain and suffering, and then being saved by one's knight in shining armor and having this happy ending where one is embraced and loved and you're perfect and this person is perfect, and you have this happy fairy tale ending. I mean, one has to be self-honest about what desire it is that one is in fact fulfilling and living out through the scene that's playing in the movies. And this will be the prominent connection in relation to being overwhelmed with tears when watching happy fairy tale endings, where there's an equal and one desire that exists within self. I mean, it can even go to the detail where one had fantasized about it within self in playing out a total life for oneself and another person, and how one would go about experiencing that hypothetical life, and then meeting, and then having kissing and hugging, and even going into sex and having a life together. I mean, one has to look at what fantasies one had created, manifested, and designed within self. So that would be the context of crying within movies in a positive context. Then we have within a negative context in relation to where one see in movies where someone dies or someone is killed and but within the entire film or movie, they're made to be a very important part of the entire story, and they connected this character into all the relationships of all the other characters within the movie or film. And with that main person dying or being killed in a horrific way, or in a very painful, suffering way, either through being killed or dying with illness or disease, and one within that moment become overwhelmed with crying, one has to consider where such moments exist in one's world and reality. And what happens in that moment is one actually reference that killing or death that happens with the character that one is related to within the movie with someone within one's own life. And what happened within one's mind in that moment is all one's relationships came up that is most closest or intimate within one's world and reality. And one considered what would happen if you would experience such an unexpected, sudden death within a relationship that exists in your world and reality. And then what instead we do is we generate and charge such fears within ourselves even more through relating it to what we're seeing within movies, instead of investigating our actual experiences toward death and loss. And within the principle of bringing it back to self, one within that initially realized that one is simply becoming overwhelmed within the fear of death and fear of loss. So one can investigate for self within self where those contexts exist quite extensively, in where your relationships are defined within fear of death and fear of loss, in living within one's relationship within that nature, and then one's relationships are defined in fear instead of actually living with one's relationships in one's world and reality, and really getting to know oneself with others and allowing oneself to really experience living instead of always existing within fear of death and fear of loss. And then we have, for example, where one become overwhelmed with emotion and feeling in sounds, like for example someone singing. And what happens here is within oneself, throughout one's life experience, what the mind consciousness system do, especially in relation to media, movies, pictures, stories, conversations, songs, everything is accumulated within oneself into a total memory database to which one relate oneself, meaning one's preferences, one's likes, one's dislikes, how one experience oneself in relation to relationships, to sex, to the world, to money, to politics, to clothing, to food. I mean, everything accumulates within oneself as all the relationships that one have within oneself towards one's entire world and reality. And from that, one accordingly construct and build personalities. So one has to have a look at when one is becoming overwhelmed with energy, when one is hearing a song, one has to have a look at the sound of the person singing and the nature of the words of the song that the person is singing. Because if one can relate to that person singing within the context, let's say she's singing a love song, and the pitch of her voice contain her emotional feeling body in relation to sex, love, and relationship, and you have within yourself what activates upon hearing her singing and the words and the resonance of who she is within what she's singing or he is singing. And that resonates through you, and that activates all your memories in relation to love, sex, relationships within the context of the resonance of desiring and hoping for that perfect someone and life and love. You will then become overwhelmed with energy because all of your memories within yourself in relation to love, sex, and relationships is activated. And with that activation, it resonates with the resonance. It then stimulates all of one's hopes, desires, dreams, and wishes. And because it's within the context of hopes, desires, dreams, and wishes, it can then overwhelm you, because it's like a hope is something that one in fact do know of. The chances of something like that actually really happening is really slim, but one still enjoys hoping because it stimulates desires and fantasies and imaginations. And then within that hope, one start crying because from a certain extent one wish that something like that would happen, but at the same time you know it won't, because it's just a fantasy, it's an imagination. So it's more like a realization moment that manifests in that moment. And then one going to crying when one hears another person singing. So when this especially happens with the crying in hearing someone singing, one has to look at the words of the song, and because it's all within the words, the person will sing the song in a certain energetic experience in relation to what the words mean to them. So you have to look at what the words mean to you within your frames of reference, within your mind, and have a look at what this reaction is indicating, showing, and revealing. And one can then, for example, see that one is still hanging on to hope, desire, fantasies, and imaginations about love, sex, and relationships, and then accordingly assist and support oneself to drop such fantasies and imaginations and walk into and with and as reality, and rather establishing an effective, real agreement that one can walk with another real human being. Then one will also, for example, experience reactions within oneself, within one's mind consciousness system, in relation to world events, atrocious pictures, seeing suffering, pain, things like that of other human beings. What your reactions are within yourself is fear of something like that happening to you, meaning in that moment you actually within your mind, within yourself, place yourself within the position of what you're seeing through media, newspaper stories, and conversations and images, and within that it accumulates within yourself into fear of what if something like that happens to me, and all your reactions stem from that, because the mind consciousness system also protects itself within that reaction you're having towards what is happening in world events, because what will manifest within your mind, yourself, your physical world and reality, is that you'll push yourself to make sure that you're always protected in the system, that you've got money, that you're motivated in your work, and that you're always secure in your life and your living, and you will live in such a way to make sure that you do not step out of line of the system as a whole. And thus, essentially, everyone in this world and reality has got reactions towards what is happening, yet never really actually physically, practically doing something in terms of presenting or implementing a solution to such atrocity, suffering that is happening in this world and reality. Because what happens in that moment, instead of going into what is a solution, we go into reaction, within our own mind, and then it is transferred into, I must protect myself to make sure that that doesn't happen to me, instead of considering a solution that is best for all. So when you have reactions toward what is happening in world events, one is to consider walking that line of self-forgiveness in the fear of something like that happening to me, walk that out of oneself, and then consider, when looking and seeing such atrocities, pain, suffering in this world and reality, rather than going into reaction, go into what solution can be presented within this context that stands within the principle of what's best for all. And we've walked this in another video interview in where we discussed in how to walk the world system within self-honesty, writing, self-forgiveness, to see and take responsibility for what we've accepted and allowed in this world, and how we can change and direct it into what is and will be best for all. Alright, so here's just a quick interview in terms of what is reactions of crying when seeing various aspects of media in our world and reality. Thank you very much.